Earlier this year, the co-founder of OpenAI, Andre Karpathy, wrote a thread complaining about how Claude writes code.
Excuse me, what?
He mentions 3 failure modes. Forrest Chang read the thread and packaged the complaints into 4 behavioral rules inside a single text file called Claude.md and dropped it on GitHub. Currently sitting at 160,000 stars, it became the fastest growing single file repo of 2026. I've been testing it over the last 2 months, and what can I say? The rules work. On average, Claude would make mistakes 41% of the time, but after implementing these 4 simple rules, mistakes dropped down to 11%. I spent weeks experimenting and found 8 additional rules that were able to bring those total errors from 11% down to a tiny 3%. Today, I'm going to share all 12 rules I use alongside the mistakes each one prevents, and then at the end, I'll even share what not to do when making your own rules. Let's go. Oh, and if we haven't met yet, I'm Doobie. I build apps every day using Claude, and I've generated $47,000 in less than 50 days using these exact AI tools. So trust me when I say this. The Claude.md file is the most leveraged file in the entire Claude AI stack. Most people either treat it as a dump for every preference that they've ever had in their lives, bloat it to 4,000 plus tokens, which is known to drastically drop its success rate, by the way, or they'll skip it entirely and prompt every time, which results in a 5x token waste and no consistency between sessions. Or maybe they just copy a template once and forget about it. The official Anthropic docs are explicit. Claude.md is advisory. Claude actually follows it about 80% of the time, but if it's larger than 200 lines, compliance drops sharply because the most important rules get buried in the noise. Karpathy's template solved this with just 65 lines and 4 rules. With the extra 8 rules I add, the total file ends up around 180 lines, well below the safety cap. So here are the 4 original rules. Rule 1, think before coding. No silent assumptions. State what you're assuming. Surface trade-offs, ask before guessing. Push back when a simpler approach exists. Rule 2, simplicity first. Minimum code that solves the problem. No speculative features, no abstractions for single-use code. If a senior engineer would call it overcomplicated, simplify it. Rule 3, surgical changes. Touch only what you must. Don't improve adjacent code, comments, or formatting. Don't refactor what isn't broken. Match existing style. And then rule 4, goal-driven execution. Define success criteria. Loop until verified. Don't tell Claude what steps to follow, tell it what success looks like and let it iterate. So I ran an experiment and I tracked this for 6 weeks and I counted a mistake anytime the task needed a correction or rewrite to match what I actually wanted. With no rules, Claude had 41% mistake rate. After adding Karpathy's 4 rules, that dropped to 11%. With my 12 rules, it dropped to 3%. But the interesting part is the compliance barely changed. Karpathy's 4 rules had 78% visible compliance, and my 12 rules had 76%. So adding 8 more rules didn't overload the file, because they weren't repeating the same idea, they were covering different failure modes. That's the lesson. More rules is not necessarily better, more specific rules for real failures is. So now that you know Karpathy's 4 rules, let me show you the additional 8 rules that I actually added to fix the remaining 60% of failure points. The first rule I implemented was that token budgets are not advisory. Without a budget, agent loops will just keep going. I had a debugging session run for 90 minutes on the same 8 kilobyte error message. By the end, Claude was suggesting fixes I'd rejected 40 messages earlier. It wasn't thinking harder, it was just lost with confidence. So I added per task 4,000 tokens, per session 30,000 tokens. If approaching budget, summarize and start fresh. Trust me when I say this, but this rule alone will save you a ton of tokens. Rule 6 is surface conflicts, don't average them. Claude likes trying to make both sides happy. So if one part of your code handles errors one way and another part handles errors a different way, Claude might accidentally write code that mixes both. Now the same error is being handled twice. Things get hidden and nobody knows what's actually going on. So the rule is simple. If 2 patterns conflict, don't blend them together, just pick one. Usually the newer one or the one that has been tested more, then explain why you picked it and mark the other one as something to clean up later. Because average code is usually the worst code. Rule 7, read before you write. Karpathy's surgical rule says don't touch nearby code unless you need to. But the problem is, that doesn't force Claude to actually understand the nearby code before adding something new. I watched Claude add a new function right next to an existing function that already did the exact same thing. Why? Because it hadn't read 30 lines higher in the file. Now, I've got two functions doing the same job, and the new one got used because of import order, but the old one has been the trusted version for 6 months. Pain. So now the rule is, before adding new code, Claude needs to check the file exports, place where the code gets called, and any obvious shared utilities. Looks unrelated to me is not good enough. That's how your code base ends up looking like it got hit with a chair. Rule 8, use the model only for judgment calls. This one came from a workflow where I had Claude decide whether to retry an API call, and it worked perfectly for 2 weeks. Then suddenly it started getting flaky. Why? Because Claude started reading the request body as part of the decision. So instead of retrying based on clear rules that I set earlier, it was now retrying based on whatever was inside the prompt. The retry policy became random because the prompt was random. Duh. The rule is, use Claude for things like classification, drafting, summarizing, extraction, and judgment, but don't use Claude for routing, retries, status codes, or anything that should follow a fixed rule. If code can answer it, code should answer it. If a 503 status code already tells you to retry, don't ask a language model for its opinion. That's like asking a poet to operate a traffic light. If you're using Claude and Codex separately, then you're only really getting 20% out of their capabilities. The other 80% comes from getting them to collaborate with each other. But tab hopping can be annoying, and it all falls apart when your workflow has multiple steps. That's why I built Ace. It's a sandbox for your agents to easily collaborate with each other on a canvas, and it connects to your subscriptions, so you don't even have to pay for those costly API bills. The results speak for themselves. If you want to try out Ace for yourself, I'll leave a link in the description below. Now, before I share the last 4 rules, I obviously made a lot of errors along the way. So here are the things I tried that didn't work out. First, adding random rules I saw on Reddit and X. Most of them were either Karpathy's 4 rules with different wording, or they were too specific. For example, always use Tailwind classes. That might be useful in one project, but it doesn't work everywhere, so I cut them. Second, having more than 12 rules. I tested up to 18, and once I went past 14, rules compliance dropped from 76% to 52%. The 200 line limit is real. Once the file gets too long, Claude starts acting like rules exist without actually reading and following them properly. Third, rules that depend on tools that might not exist. For example, always use ESLint. That breaks the moment ESLint isn't even installed, and worse, it can fail silently. So I replaced the rules like that with more flexible wording. Instead of saying use ESLint, the rule becomes match the code base's enforced style. Fourth, putting examples in Claude.md instead of rules. You see, examples are expensive. 3 examples can use as much context as around 10 rules. And Claude starts copying the example too closely. Rules are general, examples are very specific. So for this, rules worked better. 5, saying things like be careful, think hard, or really focus. It's just noise. Claude only followed those around 30% of the time because they're not testable. So replace them with clear instructions like state assumptions explicitly. 6, telling Claude to be senior. Now, I know this is everyone's favorite, but this doesn't actually work because Claude already thinks it's a senior. The problem is not confidence. The problem is getting it to actually do the right thing. Clear rules close that gap. Identity prompts don't. Now you know what not to do. Let me share the 4 remaining rules. So these last 4 are going to be all about stopping Claude from producing that fake success. Rule 9, tests verify intent, not just behavior. This one actually matters a lot. Claude loves writing tests that technically pass, but don't actually test anything. I had an auth function where Claude wrote 12 tests. All of them passed. Auth was still broken. Why? Because the tests were only checking that the function returned something. They weren't checking that it returned the right thing based on the actual business logic. One function was basically returning the same answer every time, and the tests clapped like seals. So the rule is, every test needs to prove why the behavior matters, not just something happening. A test that can't fail when the business logic breaks is not a real test. It's just decoration. Rule 10. Checkpoint after every significant step. Long Claude code tasks are where things get messy. I had a 6-step refactor go wrong at step 4, but before I noticed, Claude had already built steps 5 and 6 on top of the broken version. Fixing it takes a lot longer than just starting again, so now, after every significant step, Claude had to summarize 3 things. What was done, what was verified, and what's still left. If it can't explain the current state back to me, it doesn't get to continue. Rule 11. Match the codebase's conventions, even if you disagree. This is a big one because Claude has taste. Sometimes that taste is good.
Nice.
Other times it feels like a junior developer watched 4 React tutorials and decided the whole codebase needed a personality transplant. I had Claude add hooks into a class component codebase. The code worked, but it broke the testing pattern because the tests expected lifecycle methods. Half a day gone. The rule is if the codebase uses snake_case, use snake_case. If it uses class components, use class components. If it has a weird file structure, match it. Inside an existing codebase, matching the style matters more than having better taste. If Claude thinks the convention is bad, it can say that, but it can't quietly create its own style. That's the problem. Rule 12, fail loud. This is my favorite one. The most expensive AI failure is not when Claude says, I can't do it anymore. The most expensive failure is actually when Claude says, done, but sometimes failing quietly underneath. I had Claude tell me a migration finished successfully, but it had skipped 14% of the records because of a constraint issue. The skip was in the logs. Claude just didn't mention it. I found out 11 days later when the report started looking wrong. So the rule is completed is wrong if anything was skipped silently. Tests pass is wrong if any tests were skipped. Feature works is wrong if the edge case wasn't checked. Claude should surface uncertainty by default. Don't hide it. If Claude isn't sure, I want it to say that. I'd rather hear I couldn't verify this than lose a weekend because the robot wanted to sound useful. So that's all 12 rules. Here's the file on screen. You can pause and screenshot this, or I'll put it in the description below. Just make sure to save it as a Claude.md inside the folder you use Claude in, and add your project specific rules underneath. Just keep the whole thing under 200 lines if you can. If it grows too big, split task specific workflows into skills or separate docs. Subscribe if you want more AI workflows like this, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.